The first time I realized something was seriously wrong was when I drove up to land I legally owned and found two men in black tactical vests standing behind a chained gate with rifles slung across their chests, and one of them calmly told me I was trespassing on private property and would be detained if I took another step, and for a split second my brain refused to process the idea that an HOA, not the police, not the county, but a homeowners association, had decided to put armed guards on my ranch, and threatened to arrest me for standing on dirt I had bought fair and square 3 months earlier. And in that moment my shock wasn't fear, it was disbelief mixed with a strange dark humor, because I remember thinking I paid less for this abandoned land than some people pay in HOA fines, and yet here I was staring down hired muscle like I had wandered into a bad movie set. But the click of a rifle strap being adjusted snapped me back into reality, and I realized this was not a joke, and this was only the beginning of something much bigger and much uglier. 3 months earlier the land had felt like the opposite of conflict. It was quiet, overlooked, forgotten, the kind of property no one wanted because it sat just beyond the edge of a manicured suburban development where cookie-cutter houses stopped and raw scrubland began. The county listing called it surplus, abandoned, no utilities, no road maintenance, no HOA jurisdiction, which was exactly why I bought it, because I wanted space, not neighbors, not rules, not someone measuring my grass height with a ruler. And when the deed cleared and the county clerk stamped it with bored indifference, I thought the hardest part was over. I had plans, simple ones: a fence, a small storage barn, maybe livestock someday, nothing loud, nothing flashy, just mine. And for the first few weeks the land stayed silent, except for wind and birds, until the letters started arriving, polite at first, informing me that I was in violation of community standards, which made me laugh, because I wasn't in their community then. The letters turned sharper, warning of fines, liens, and enforcement actions, signed by an HOA board that didn't exist on any county map I checked. And when I emailed back with copies of my deed and parcel map, they responded by claiming clerical error, insisting my land had always been under their control despite records going back 40 years showing otherwise. And that was when I realized logic meant nothing to people who believed authority came from confidence alone. The first in-person confrontation happened on a Saturday morning when I was marking fence lines, and a woman in oversized sunglasses marched across the dirt like she owned gravity itself, followed by 2 men holding clipboards, and she introduced herself as the HOA president and informed me I was illegally developing common land and needed to stop immediately. And I calmly told her she was standing on my property, which she dismissed with a laugh so sharp it sounded rehearsed, and said, "We decide what property is ours, and you will learn that soon," and walked away like she had just issued a royal decree. And I stood there stunned, not angry yet, just confused at the audacity. But that confusion turned to concern when a survey crew I hired was turned away the next week by a temporary gate installed overnight and security signs that hadn't been there before. And when I called the sheriff's non-emergency line, they told me it sounded like a civil dispute and advised me to document everything, which I did: photos, dates, letters, recordings. And still I never imagined the HOA would escalate beyond paperwork until the morning I drove up and met the guard. They stood relaxed, professional, clearly hired from a private security company, not local volunteers playing cop. And that was what chilled me the most, because someone had spent real money to intimidate me. And when I asked under what authority they were blocking access, one of them gestured to a laminated document zip-tied to the gate claiming private road enforcement, and threatened arrest for trespass and disorderly conduct. And I remember laughing despite myself, because the document misspelled the county name and cited statutes that didn't apply. And when I pointed that out, the guard's expression didn't change, and he said, "Sir, I don't write the rules, I just enforce them." And that was when fear finally crept in, not fear of being shot, but fear of how far people would go when they were wrong and refused to admit it. I stepped back, got in my truck, and drove straight to the county offices, where a clerk confirmed again that my land was outside HOA boundaries and suggested I contact an attorney. And as I left the building, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from the HOA president warning me that continued defiance would result in detention, removal, and charges. And she said it like she was daring me to test her authority, and for the first time anger replaced disbelief, because this wasn't ignorance anymore, it was deliberate and calculated, and when I returned home that night I realized this story wasn't about land anymore, it was about power and control, and how far an entitled group would push when someone refused to bow, and I knew standing my ground would cost time, money, and stress, but backing down would cost something worse, and as I lay awake replaying the image of armed guards on my ranch, I understood one thing with absolute clarity: this HOA had made a massive mistake, and they had just dragged me into a fight they were not prepared to finish. The morning after the armed guards appeared, I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking like someone preparing for a long fight, because panic only helps the side that wants you to make mistakes, and I knew if I lost my temper even once, the HOA would spin it into proof that I was unstable. So I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and laid out every document I had: the deed, the parcel map, the county email confirmations, the survey order receipts, and the threatening HOA letters. And as I looked at the stack, I realized how absurd the situation was. On paper, an association with no legal boundary claim was acting like a private government, complete with enforcement and muscle, and the more I read their letters, the clearer it became that this wasn't confusion, it was strategy. They were counting on intimidation to make me walk away quietly the way others probably had in the past, and that realization hardened something in me, because I had grown up watching bullies operate the same way. Loud confidence, false authority, and relentless pressure, and the only thing that ever stopped them was someone who refused to blink. I called a local land use attorney recommended by the county clerk, and within 10 minutes of explaining the situation, he went silent, then laughed, and said, "I wish I was surprised, but I'm not," and told me to email everything immediately, which I did, and within the hour he called back and said the HOA was so far out of bounds it was impressive, and advised me not to confront the guards again directly, but to document their presence and let the legal process corner them instead, and that advice proved wise, because by midday another letter arrived, this time taped to the gate itself, declaring the land seized for community protection, citing emergency powers that do not exist, and warning that any attempt to enter would result in citizen arrest, which would have been funny if it weren't so serious. And as I stood there reading it from outside the fence, one of the guards approached and asked if I needed help, in the tone of someone who absolutely did not want to help, and I told him calmly that I was the property owner and was documenting illegal trespass, and he shrugged and said, "Take it up with the HOA," and for a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes, discomfort, maybe doubt, because he knew he was standing on shaky ground, but a paycheck has a way of silencing conscience. That afternoon my attorney sent a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA board and the security company outlining trespass, unlawful detention, threats, impersonation of law enforcement, and civil liability, and CC'd the county sheriff. And when I read the draft before it went out, I felt something close to relief, because finally the situation was being framed in the language that mattered, not outrage but consequence, and for a brief hopeful moment I thought that would be the end of it, that someone on the HOA board would read it, panic, call a meeting, and tell everyone to stand down. But hope has a short shelf life when entitlement is involved, because instead of backing off they doubled down. By evening the HOA president left me a voicemail that sounded like a victory speech. She accused me of harassment, claimed their guards were there for public safety, and warned that lawyers would not scare them because they had powerful connections. And when she said that, I almost admired the confidence, because it takes a special kind of person to threaten someone while actively committing multiple crimes and believing connections will save you. And that was when I decided to stop assuming these people would behave rationally, because rational people do not hire armed guards over a boundary dispute. They invent authority and dare the world to challenge it. The next day I returned with a friend who worked as a licensed surveyor, not to perform the survey but to observe and document, and we never crossed the gate. We simply stood on the public road while he pointed out visible markers in the distance and explained loudly how the HOA boundary stopped well short of my land, and the guards watched us the entire time, one of them clearly recording on his phone, and I made sure to narrate everything, stating dates, names, and facts so there would be no confusion. later, and that small act of calm defiance must have rattled someone, because within an hour a sheriff's deputy arrived, not to arrest me, but to assess the situation, and I handed him copies of my deed and the cease and desist letter, and while he read it the guards shifted their weight and suddenly seemed far less confident, and the deputy asked them who authorized their presence, and they gestured vaguely toward the HOA president, who was not there, and when he asked for written authority they had nothing, and he told them this was a civil matter, and advised them to disengage or risk liability, and they didn't leave, but they did step back, and for the first time since this began I saw the power dynamic crack. That crack widened later that night when my attorney forwarded me an internal HOA email chain accidentally sent to him, instead of another board member, and in it, they openly discussed intimidating me into selling the land back to the association at a discount to expand their greenbelt, and complained that I was being difficult by knowing the law, and one message joked that once the guards scared me enough I would fold, and reading that turned my anger cold, because this was no longer a misunderstanding, it was a calculated attempt to steal property through fear, and suddenly every ridiculous threat, every fake notice, every armed presence snapped into focus as part of a single ugly plan, and I realized that by standing my ground I wasn't just protecting my land, I was exposing something rotten, and that knowledge gave me clarity and resolve, and as I forwarded the email to my attorney and the sheriff I understood that the HOA had crossed a line they could not uncross, and that the next move would determine whether they backed down quietly or detonated their own authority in public, and given everything I had seen so far I had a sinking feeling they were about to choose the louder option. By the third week the situation had evolved from surreal to openly hostile, and what unsettled me most was how normal the HOA tried to make it feel like armed guards and fabricated authority were just another line item on a budget spreadsheet, and every morning I woke up to new emails, new notices, and new rumors circulating through the nearby neighborhood about me being dangerous, uncooperative, or secretly planning something illegal, and I realized they were laying groundwork, turning public opinion before the real confrontation, because people who intend to do the wrong thing often try to poison the well first, and sure enough a local community forum lit up with posts accusing me of blocking emergency access, destroying protected land, and refusing to follow rules that never applied to me, and at first I considered responding point by point, but my attorney advised silence because lies collapse under scrutiny when facts are solid and emotions are kept out of it, so instead I kept documenting everything, every sign, every guard shift, every vehicle plate, every interaction, and when you start paying attention that closely patterns emerge, and I noticed the guards rotated inconsistently, sometimes disappearing for hours, which told me their contract was being stretched thin and that pressure was mounting behind the scenes. That theory proved right when a second security company truck appeared unmarked, clearly cheaper and less professional than the first, and one of the guards from the original company quietly told me from across the gate, without meeting my eyes, that things were getting messy, and that comment stuck with me because it meant cracks were spreading, and entitlement hates cracks because they let reality seep in. Midweek my attorney filed an injunction request with the county court seeking immediate removal of the guards and restoration of access, and while we waited for a hearing date, the HOA launched their most aggressive move, yet they staged a dramatic enforcement walk complete with matching jackets, clipboards, and a camera crew from a small local channel they likely tipped off, framing it as a community safety operation, and when I arrived and saw the camera pointed at the gate I understood exactly what they were trying to do: provoke me into reacting on film, so they could brand me the villain, and I played my role by not playing at all. I parked legally, stood on public ground, and calmly read from my deed, while the HOA president shouted over me about emergency authority and community protection, and the cameraman kept zooming in on her face, red with indignation, and I remember thinking if arrogance could sweat this would be it, because the harder she tried to dominate, the more unstable she looked. And when a reporter finally asked her to explain how an HOA could detain someone or block a landowner without a court order, she snapped that they had legal counsel and refused to elaborate, which was the moment I knew this spectacle had backfired. That night the segment aired, and instead of sympathy the comments exploded with skepticism. Lawyers chimed in explaining HOA limits, former board members shared horror stories, and someone posted screenshots of county maps proving my land lay outside their jurisdiction entirely, and suddenly the narrative flipped, and the HOA president went from protector to punchline almost overnight, and nothing enrages entitled people more than losing control of the story, because control is their oxygen. And the next morning they retaliated by escalating again, this time installing concrete barriers on the access road claiming emergency repairs, and when I saw that I felt something close to awe at their audacity, because they had moved from threats to physical alteration of land they did not own, and my attorney immediately contacted the sheriff and the county road department, and within hours officials arrived, photographed the barriers, and ordered them removed, and watching that happen felt like watching someone pull bricks out of a collapsing wall, because every illegal move forced them to expose another weakness. But entitlement rarely retreats gracefully, and that afternoon I received a notice of intent to arrest signed, not by a judge, not by law enforcement, but by the HOA board itself, citing internal enforcement powers, and threatening me with citizen detention if I attempted to enter my land again, and I stared at it for a long time, not angry, not afraid, just incredulous at how far they had drifted from reality, and I forwarded it to my attorney, who responded with a single line: "They just made this much easier." And when he explained that the HOA had now documented their own impersonation of authority, I felt the balance tip decisively, because this was no longer my word against theirs, it was their words against the law. The real turning point came 2 days later, when one of the guards approached me quietly while his partner was distracted, and told me their company was pulling out because the HOA had misrepresented the situation and failed to provide legal authorization, and that several guards had refused to return after realizing they were being used to intimidate a lawful landowner. And hearing that was strangely sobering, because it reminded me that even people hired to enforce bad decisions have limits, and those limits had been reached. And sure enough, by sunset the first security company trucks were gone, leaving behind only the cheaper guards and a hastily printed sign asserting private authority that looked more desperate than official. And for the first time since this began I felt something like momentum shift fully in my favor. That feeling intensified when the county scheduled the injunction hearing, and the clerk told my attorney off the record that the judge was not pleased because judges tend to dislike when private groups pretend to wield state power, and that knowledge sat heavy and satisfying in my chest, because it meant the reckoning was no longer theoretical, it was scheduled. And as I stood one evening looking at the darkening land beyond the gate, listening to wind move through grass that had done nothing wrong, I realized this fight had grown beyond my purchase, beyond fences and access roads. It had become a test of whether entitlement could manufacture authority through sheer force of will, or whether facts, patience, and law would still win. And I knew the HOA sensed that test too, because their silence that night was louder than any threat they had issued before, and in that quiet I understood they were planning something final, something dramatic, something they believed would reassert control, and whatever it was would decide how this story ended. The day of the injunction hearing arrived with a strange calm that felt earned, because by then the chaos had a shape and I understood where the pressure points were. And as I drove toward the courthouse my phone buzzed non-stop with updates, neighbors sending screenshots, guards quitting, HOA emails leaking, and my attorney reminding me to say nothing unnecessary and let the facts do the work. And when we entered the courtroom the contrast was almost comical. On one side me and my attorney with organized binders, maps, and calm expressions; on the other side the HOA president, flanked by 2 board members and a lawyer who looked like he had been handed this case 5 minutes earlier and was already regretting his life choices. And when proceedings began it became immediately clear that the judge was not amused by private groups pretending to wield public power, because every time the HOA attorney tried to justify armed guards the judge stopped him and asked under what statute, under what Order under what authority? And each time the answer was vague, circling back to community safety and internal governance, which only made the judge lean back and stare like a parent listening to a child explain why rules should not apply to them. And when my attorney presented the deed county confirmation and the email chain discussing intimidation, the room shifted visibly, because arrogance collapses fast when it is forced to sit under fluorescent lights and legal scrutiny. And within minutes the judge issued a temporary order requiring immediate removal of all guards, barriers, and signage, and restoring my access pending a full hearing. And as the words left his mouth, I felt a release I had not allowed myself to feel until that moment, because until then everything had been provisional. But this was authority, real authority, and the HOA had just lost a major pillar of their illusion. I expected that to be the end of the escalation, at least temporarily, but entitlement does not always accept defeat quietly, and as I drove back toward the land that afternoon I saw flashing lights ahead, and my heart rate spiked for half a second until I realized they were sheriff vehicles, not HOA guards. And when I pulled up, the deputy waved me through the now open gate and told me the court order had been served and the remaining guards were being escorted off the property. And watching them pack up felt surreal, because weeks earlier they had blocked me with confidence, and now they avoided eye contact, loading equipment like stagehands after a cancelled show. And I thought that would be the dramatic peak, but the HOA was not finished embarrassing itself, because as soon as the guards left, the president arrived screaming that the sheriff had no right to interfere with private enforcement, and the deputy calmly informed her that impersonation of authority and unlawful detention were criminal matters, and that if she continued obstructing access she could be cited or arrested. And that word finally broke through her certainty, and for a moment her face flickered with genuine fear, and I almost felt pity until I remembered every threat, every lie, every attempt to steal what was mine, and the pity evaporated. That evening I walked the land freely for the first time in weeks, and it felt different, heavier, like the ground itself had been waiting. And I took photos, video measurements, and notes, not out of paranoia but closure, and as I did I noticed something that would later become critical: fresh tire tracks beyond where the guards had been stationed, leading toward a low area near the boundary. And when I followed them I found evidence of recent dumping. Debris, concrete scraps, and fencing material clearly placed during the days they controlled access. And I photographed everything, because when entitlement retreats it often tries to muddy the ground literally and figuratively, and that discovery set the stage for the next confrontation, because the next morning the HOA sent out a community-wide email accusing me of environmental violations and illegal dumping, attaching photos that conveniently ignored their own activity, and claimed they would pursue enforcement through the county. And when my attorney read it, he laughed, the kind of laugh that means someone has walked straight into a trap, and he explained that the HOA had just documented false reporting and defamation, and worse, that the county inspectors would find the debris matched materials purchased by the HOA for the barriers they installed illegally. And sure enough, within 2 days county officials arrived, inspected the site, traced the materials, and issued citations not to me but to the HOA for illegal dumping, obstruction, and unauthorized construction. And when that news spread, the narrative collapsed entirely, because it was no longer a private dispute, it was public record. The final confrontation of that week came unexpectedly when the HOA president showed up at my gate, without guards, without cameras, just anger and desperation, and she demanded to speak to me directly. And against my attorney's advice I agreed with the sheriff present, because I wanted to see the moment entitlement realized it was out of moves. And she launched into a speech about community values and precedent, and how allowing me to own the land would lower property values. And I listened quietly until she finished, and then I told her calmly that I had never asked for their approval, that the land was never theirs, and that every step they took to intimidate me had only ensured consequences far worse than if they had respected the law from the beginning. And when she threatened to appeal and drag this out for years, the deputy reminded her that additional charges were being reviewed, and that silence would be wise. And in that moment the power imbalance inverted completely, and she knew it. And As she walked away smaller than she had ever seemed, I realized something important. This was never about me or my land. It was about a system that had grown comfortable confusing confidence with authority and mistaking compliance for consent, and by refusing to fold I had forced that system into daylight, and daylight is unforgiving, and as the sun set over land that finally felt quiet again, I understood the hardest part was over, but the consequences for the HOA were only beginning. By the time the dust settled from the injunction, the atmosphere around the land had changed completely, and what surprised me most was not the silence from the HOA, but the sudden noise from everyone else, because once the illusion of authority cracked, people who had been quiet started reaching out. Neighbors from the edge of the development, former board members, even a contractor who said he had been pressured years earlier to ignore boundary rules, and all of them told variations of the same story. Intimidation dressed up as governance, and it became clear that what happened to me was not an exception but simply the first time someone had pushed back hard enough to expose it, and as those messages piled up, my attorney advised me to slow down and be strategic, because momentum is powerful but only if you do not outrun it, and that advice proved wise because the HOA shifted tactics almost immediately from aggression to performance and began presenting themselves as victims of an overreaction, claiming they were misunderstood volunteers who acted in good faith and were now being harassed by a hostile landowner. And if that sounds ridiculous, it was, but ridiculous stories gain traction when repeated often enough, and soon I was receiving media inquiries framed around community conflict rather than unlawful behavior, and I understood then that Chapter 5 of this fight would not be fought at gates or in courtrooms but in narratives. The HOA called a special community meeting and live-streamed it, which I watched from my kitchen table, and listening to them speak was like watching someone rewrite history in real time. They claimed the guards were a misunderstanding, the barriers were temporary safety measures, and the threats were exaggerated misunderstandings, and when a homeowner asked why county citations were issued against the HOA, the president deflected and blamed contractors, and at that moment I saw panic beneath the polish. Because deflection only works when people are not asking follow-up questions, and the follow-ups kept coming, and the livestream comments grew brutal, because the documents were now public and facts have a way of circulating faster than spin when the internet is involved. My attorney recommended we file a civil suit, not out of revenge but necessity, because without it the HOA could drag this out through harassment and delay, and filing would lock facts into the record and protect me from further interference. And when he laid out the claims: trespass, false imprisonment, impersonation, defamation, and damages, the list felt heavy, not satisfying heavy, but sobering, because each claim represented something that should never have happened, and once the suit was filed the tone changed overnight, because suddenly this was no longer a noisy neighbor dispute, it was a legal reckoning with financial consequences, and HOA boards fear one thing above all else: liability, because it pierces the illusion that they are untouchable. Within days insurance carriers got involved, and that was when the real fractures appeared, because insurers do not care about ego or precedent, they care about risk and exposure, and once they reviewed the armed guard contracts and the fake enforcement notices, they began issuing reservation of rights letters, which in plain language meant you may be on your own for this, and board members who had happily voted yes when intimidation felt abstract now faced personal exposure, and the shift was immediate resignations, announcements, emergency elections, and frantic emails asking for mediation, and I agreed to mediation, not because I trusted them but because I wanted their concessions documented and irreversible, and during that session watched through a screen the same people who once threatened arrest now speak carefully, choose words slowly, and ask permission before making requests, and the contrast was almost surreal. The mediation revealed something else too, something that reframed the entire conflict when documents surfaced showing that the HOA had been warned years earlier by county planners that their boundary claims were invalid, and that any attempt to enforce beyond them would be unlawful, and they had acknowledged those warnings in writing, which meant their actions against me were not just reckless, they were knowing and deliberate, and when that became clear, the mediator went quiet and then told them, plainly that this would not end well if it went to trial, and for the first time since this began I saw genuine fear, not performative outrage, but the fear of people realizing the system they hid behind would not save them, and that fear softened their posture fast. While the legal gears turned, I focused on the land itself, because reclaiming it physically mattered as much as reclaiming it legally, and I brought in my survey crew again, this time with full access and sheriff awareness, and watching the markers go in felt grounding, because lines drawn correctly have power, and as they worked neighbors gathered at a distance curious, cautious, and some even apologized for believing rumors, and I accepted those apologies without bitterness, because fear spreads easily when authority figures misuse it, and undoing that fear takes time and presence and honesty, and by the end of the week, the land looked like land again, not a contested zone but soil and grass and space, and that shift mattered more than I expected. The HOA attempted one final narrative push by sending out a glossy newsletter claiming reforms, transparency, and lessons learned, and while it sounded noble it rang hollow, because nowhere did it acknowledge harm and accountability without acknowledgement is just damage control, and that distinction did not go unnoticed by homeowners who began asking harder questions about finances, governance, and prior actions, and what followed was something I never anticipated: a recall effort against the board. Itself driven not by me but by the community they claimed to protect, and watching that unfold was strange, because I had never wanted to be the center of this, but entitlement tends to collapse inward when exposed, and it does not need outside force once people see the pattern clearly. By the end of that month the guards were gone, the barriers were gone, the signs were gone, and what remained were court dates, insurance negotiations, and a board scrambling to distance itself from its own decisions, and as I stood one evening at the edge of my land watching survey flags catch the light, I realized that Chapter 5 was not about winning, it was about stabilization, about shifting from reaction to resolution, and understanding that the true consequence of standing your ground is not triumph but responsibility, because when you expose something broken you inherit the task of making sure it cannot quietly reset and start again, and I knew then that while the worst threats were behind me, the final outcome would not be decided by force or anger, but by whether the truth stayed visible long enough to matter. By the time Chapter 6 unfolded, the conflict had shifted from confrontation to consequence, and that shift carried a different kind of tension, because chaos is loud but accountability is quiet and relentless, and I felt it in the way emails from the HOA slowed and changed tone, becoming cautious, filtered through lawyers stripped of bravado, and in the way former board members suddenly wanted private conversations to explain that they had voted yes because they were told everyone else had already agreed, and that realization struck me harder than any threat, because it revealed how easily systems drift into abuse when responsibility is diluted and everyone assumes someone else has verified the truth, and while those explanations did not excuse what happened, they explained how it could grow unchecked for so long. The civil case moved forward steadily, and with each filing more internal documents surfaced: contracts for security services, budget approvals, emails celebrating how effective intimidation had been in past disputes, and reading them was like peeling back layers of rot, because the language was casual, almost proud, and it became clear that the board had normalized behavior that should have stopped at the first warning, and my attorney cautioned me that discovery would be slow and sometimes ugly, but necessary, because the goal was not punishment alone, it was prevention, and that framing helped me stay grounded when frustration flared. The insurance carriers made their position unmistakably clear when they formally denied coverage for intentional acts, leaving individual board members exposed, and that single development changed everything, because suddenly the abstract idea of liability became personal and mediation requests increased, some sincere, some clearly driven by fear, and during one session a board member admitted they never believed the guards would actually confront me, that it was supposed to be symbolic pressure, and I remember thinking how often harm begins with someone convincing themselves that intimidation is just a gesture until someone gets hurt or nearly does, and that admission hardened my resolve, because intent does not disappear simply because the outcome exceeded expectation. As the legal process ground forward, the community itself continued to unravel in ways I had not anticipated, and what began as whispers turned into audits. Residents demanded transparency into how dues were spent and discovered unexplained line items, inflated legal reserves, and payments to consultants tied closely to the board president, and when those findings became public, the recall effort accelerated, transforming from a fringe complaint into a full-scale reckoning, and watching that from the outside felt surreal because I was no longer the focus. I had become a catalyst, and that came with a strange mix of relief and responsibility. The county also concluded its investigation and issued formal findings confirming the HOA had exceeded its authority, engaged in unauthorized enforcement, and misrepresented boundaries in official communications, and when that report was released it landed with weight, because it carried the voice of an institution that did not need to raise its volume to be heard, and once it was on record the HOA could no longer plausibly claim misunderstanding, and the narrative they had tried to maintain collapsed under the combined pressure of legal documentation, public scrutiny, and internal dissent. On the land itself, progress resumed in tangible ways, and that mattered more than I expected, because rebuilding after conflict is an act of reclaiming normalcy, and as fencing went up correctly aligned and access roads were cleared, I felt a steadying sense of closure, and neighbors, who once avoided eye contact, now stopped to talk, some curious, some apologetic, and some simply relieved that the tension had lifted, and those conversations reinforced something important. Fear thrives in silence, and when authority is questioned openly, it loses its grip quickly. The most unexpected moment of Chapter 6 came during a deposition, when the former HOA president was asked under oath who authorized the hiring of armed guards, and she hesitated long enough for the room to notice before naming a small group, including herself, and when asked whether she understood at the time that the land was outside HOA jurisdiction, she admitted she had been warned but believed enforcement would discourage resistance, and hearing that confirmed everything I had suspected from the beginning. This was not confusion, it was calculated risk, and she had gambled on my silence, and lost, and in that moment the emotional arc of the entire ordeal crystallized, because the story was no longer about what they did, but why they thought they could do it without consequence. As weeks passed, settlement discussions became more serious and structured, and while some part of me wanted a public trial to expose everything, my attorney reminded me that resolution can be its own form of justice when it includes binding reforms and meaningful accountability, and that perspective helped me evaluate offers not through anger but through outcome, and when the HOA proposed terms that included acknowledgement of wrongdoing, financial compensation, removal of offending board members, and legally binding restrictions on future enforcement beyond boundaries, I saw the shape of an ending that would not just close my case, but prevent similar abuse in the future. Still, even as resolution approached, tension lingered, because entitlement rarely concedes without one last attempt to save face, and that attempt came in the form of a carefully worded public statement announcing leadership changes and expressing regret for miscommunication, while stopping just short of admitting fault, and the reaction was swift and unforgiving, because by then the community had seen the documents, and half measures only deepened distrust, and that backlash finally forced full acknowledgement, and when that happened quietly without fanfare, I felt a weight lift, because truth does not need spectacle, it only needs daylight. Chapter 6 ended not with applause or celebration but with paperwork, signatures, and structural change, and as anticlimactic as that might sound, it felt right, because the real victory was not that I won but that the system that tried to intimidate me was forced to correct itself, and as I stood one evening watching the last light stretch across land that was finally undisputed, I understood that the conflict had reshaped more than boundaries, it had reshaped assumptions about authority, consent, and what happens when someone decides not to be intimidated, and that understanding carried a calm satisfaction deeper than any dramatic confrontation, because it meant the outcome would endure long after the noise faded. As the case moved toward its final phase, I found myself in an unfamiliar emotional space, not adrenaline, not anger, but something closer to reflection, because once the danger passes, your mind finally has room to replay everything and question how close it all came to going wrong, and that was especially true when I sat across from my attorney reviewing the near-final settlement terms, realizing how many safeguards had been built into a document because one group had decided rules were optional and power was something you could rent by the hour, and the settlement itself was heavy with specifics, binding boundary acknowledgments recorded with the county, permanent injunctions against enforcement beyond jurisdiction, mandatory governance training for any future board members, financial restitution, not just to me but to the association members whose dues had been misused, and the quiet resignation of the remaining board members who had clung to their positions until reality made it impossible, and reading through it felt less like winning and more like closing a dangerous door carefully so it could never slam shut on someone else. Around that time, the recall election finalized and the old board was formally removed and replaced by an interim committee overseen by an external administrator, and while that development no longer directly affected me, it carried symbolic weight, because it demonstrated that the community itself had absorbed the lesson and chosen accountability over comfort, and I noticed how quickly the tone changed in neighborhood communications. Once power shifted, language softened, transparency increased, and apologies became specific rather than abstract, and that shift confirmed something I had suspected all along: entitlement survives on silence, and once that silence breaks, its authority evaporates faster than anyone expects. I returned to the land more frequently during this period, not to supervise work, but simply to be present, and each visit felt different, lighter, as if the ground itself had been holding its breath, and was finally allowed to exhale. And one afternoon a couple approached hesitantly, introducing themselves as longtime residents who had once supported the board because they believed the narrative they were fed, and they apologized sincerely, not defensively, and that moment mattered because it reminded me that most people are not villains, they are simply cautious, and when authority figures exploit, that caution, harm spreads quietly, and resolving that harm requires patience as much as firmness. The media attention that once felt intrusive faded just as quickly as it had flared, and the final articles that did appear focused less on spectacle and more on systemic issues: the limits of HOA authority, the dangers of privatized enforcement, and the importance of property rights. And while seeing my experience reframed as a cautionary tale was strange, it also felt like closure, because the story had outgrown me and become part of a broader conversation, which was perhaps the most lasting outcome of all. The most tense moment of Chapter 7 arrived unexpectedly during a final walkthrough, when a former board member appeared unannounced and demanded to speak to me alone, and for a split second my body remembered the early days, the uncertainty, the intimidation, but I stood my ground calmly and listened as he confessed that he had always doubted the legality of what they were doing, but went along out of fear of being ostracized and losing influence, and that admission was unsettling because it revealed how ordinary the roots of abuse can be, how rarely they begin with overt malice, and how often they grow from small compromises made to preserve status. And I thanked him for his honesty, but made it clear that silence in the face of wrongdoing is still a choice, and watching him walk away I felt a strange mix of empathy and resolve, because understanding does not erase responsibility. As settlement signatures approached, my attorney reminded me to think beyond this case to how I wanted to use the land going forward, because reclaiming space is not just legal, it is personal, and I began sketching plans, not ambitious ones, just grounded steps: fencing, livestock, a small structure built deliberately within code, and that act of planning felt restorative, because it marked a return to intention rather than reaction, and each plan was a quiet affirmation that intimidation had failed to derail my purpose. The night before the final agreement was executed, I slept deeply for the first time in months and woke without the familiar knot of vigilance, and that absence was itself a revelation, because it showed how much energy fear consumes, even when you believe you are managing it. And as I drove to the signing the next morning, the road felt ordinary again: no barriers, no guards, no signs, just pavement and sky, and that ordinariness felt profound. The signing itself was uneventful, no speeches, no confrontation, just documents exchanged, signatures verified, and a final acknowledgement read into the record confirming wrongdoing and corrective action, and when it ended my attorney shook my hand, and said this will be cited for years, and while that statement carried professional satisfaction, it also carried a sense of responsibility, because precedent matters, and I understood then that the true impact of standing your ground is rarely visible immediately but unfolds quietly in future decisions made differently, because someone remembers what happened when authority went too far. Chapter 7 closed not with a dramatic scene but with a subtle shift in how I carried myself, because conflict had changed me not by hardening me but by clarifying what matters, boundaries both literal and moral, and as I walked the land one last time before heading home I realized that the fight had never really been about possession, it had been about consent, and the moment consent is assumed rather than given power becomes abuse, and knowing that gave me a peace deeper than victory, because it meant the lesson would endure long after the paperwork was filed and the story stopped being mine alone. When everything was finally over and the signatures were dry and the files were closed, I expected a surge of triumph or relief, but what settled in instead was a quiet steadiness, the kind that comes after a storm when the air feels cleaner and sounds travel farther, and in that stillness I began to understand the full weight of what had happened, because the end of a conflict does not arrive with noise, it arrives with clarity, and that clarity came to me one morning as I stood on the land alone, watching the sun lift over ground that had been fought over, threatened, fenced off, and reclaimed, and yet had remained unchanged beneath it all, because dirt does not care about titles or boards or threats, it waits and endures, and that realization felt like the final lesson of the entire ordeal. The HOA dissolved its old structure completely within weeks of the settlement, replacing it with a limited administrative association stripped of enforcement power and bound tightly to county oversight, and while that outcome was not my responsibility, it felt like a necessary conclusion, because systems that abuse authority cannot simply apologize and continue as if nothing happened, they must change shape or disappear, and watching that happen from a distance felt oddly impersonal, because by then my focus had shifted fully back to building something rather than defending against it. I began work slowly, deliberately choosing progress over spectacle, and each fence post set and each plan approved felt like reclaiming time, not land, because land can be recovered with paperwork, but time lost to fear and vigilance takes longer to heal, and yet with each ordinary task that healing advanced, and the quiet routines of ownership replaced the adrenaline of conflict. People still asked me about what happened, neighbors, friends, strangers online, and I answered honestly, but without embellishment, because drama had already taken enough oxygen, and what struck me most was how often others shared similar stories of small authorities overstepping boundaries emboldened by silence and convenience, and how rarely those stories ended with accountability and hearing that reinforced why standing firm mattered, even when it was exhausting, because each precedent shifts the balance slightly toward restraint and law and consent. The former HOA president faded from public view, and while I occasionally wondered what she thought about how everything unraveled, I realized that curiosity was unnecessary, because accountability does not require personal vindication, it requires correction and prevention, and those had been achieved, and that was enough. The land itself became a place of reflection, not bitterness, and I often walked its perimeter, not to check boundaries, but to remind myself how easily lines can be crossed when people stop respecting limits, and how important it is to redraw them clearly and maintain them calmly, and in those walks I noticed how neighbors began to treat the boundary with quiet respect, no signs, no warnings, just understanding, and that was perhaps the most meaningful change, because it showed that authority imposed breeds resentment, but authority clarified breeds cooperation. The final court notice arrived weeks later, confirming compliance and closing the case entirely, and I filed it away without ceremony, because paperwork had been the beginning of this story, and it felt fitting that paperwork would also end it, and as I closed the folder I realized that I no longer felt defined by the conflict, which was something I had feared during the worst moments when every day revolved around reaction and strategy and documentation, and that release felt like reclaiming my identity from a narrative that tried to cast me as an obstacle rather than a person. Looking back, the armed guards, the threats, the fake authority, all seemed unreal, like scenes from someone else's story, and yet the consequences were real and lasting, and that contrast underscored how quickly power can be abused when people assume no one will push back, and how fragile that power becomes once challenged by patience and facts and law. I did not emerge from this wanting to fight or prove anything, and if anything, the experience made me more committed to restraint, because true authority does not need to announce itself or posture. It operates quietly within limits and respects consent, and when those principles are violated, the cost is not just legal but communal, because trust once broken is difficult to rebuild, and watching the community slowly attempt that rebuilding reinforced how damaging overreach can be, even when it masquerades as protection. The final image that stays with me is simple and unremarkable: a gate open, a road clear, a field untouched by signs or uniforms, and in that ordinariness lies the true victory, because peace is not loud and justice does not need an audience, and the most powerful outcome of standing your ground is not that you defeat someone else, but that you restore balance where it was disturbed. And as I locked up for the night and headed home, I felt no desire to revisit the conflict or retell it for effect, because its purpose had been served and its lesson absorbed, and in that quiet closing I understood that the land had never really been abandoned. It had been waiting for someone willing to defend, not just ownership but principle, and having done that I could finally let it simply be land again, and let myself move forward unburdened, and that was the ending I had not anticipated, but the one that felt most complete.